what I wanted to talk about is a little bit of a step beyond that. And by the way, we've got a huge show today, lots of really cool stuff. We're going to talk about civil forfeitures in our second hour. The practice of police taking your stuff and keeping it. This woman who was a medical marijuana patient, and they took all her stuff, including her vibrator. And she's like, really? And so I believe she's going to be on the program in the next hour, and we're going to be talking about that. And so, a lot going on. But I wanted to share a thought with you and a question, as it were. And by the way, new data on how the super rich aren't paying their taxes. Amazing stuff about Bernie Sanders' campaign. Mere 240 people live in the town of Kensett, Iowa, but over 300 people showed up to hear Bernie a couple days ago. Then he went to Ames on Saturday for a stop at a brewery, and it was so mobbed that 100 people had to stand outside looking in through the windows. And, the same thing in Muscatine, Iowa. I mean, it's just, wow. Thousands of people in Minneapolis. So, but back to the USA Patriot Act. I want you to just step into the Wayback Machine, because I need your help on figuring out how to language this. Or I would appreciate your help on figuring out how to language this. You will recall back in the day, specifically back in March of 1944, the Vice President of the United States, Henry Wallace, was asked by the New York Times to write an op-ed or to write a piece to answer the question, are there American fascists and what should we do about them? And Henry Wallace said, yes, there are American fascists, and they're not the ones that you think. He said that the American fascists that you have to worry about, he said the really dangerous American fascists, I'm quoting from the Vice President, are not those hooked up directly or indirectly with the Axis, in other words, with Germany or Japan. The FBI has its finger on those. The dangerous American fascist is the man who wants to do in the United States in an American way what Hitler did to Germany in a Prussian way. The American fascist would prefer not to use violence. His method is to poison the channels of public information. With a fascist, the problem is never how best to present the truth to the public, but how best to use the news to deceive the public into giving the fascist and his group more money and more power. And then he summarized it by saying, they claim to be super patriots, but they would destroy every liberty guaranteed by the Constitution. This is the Vice President of the United States in 1944. They demand free enterprise, but they are the spokesman for monopoly and vested interest. Did you see this thing on the drug companies now? How in the midst of billions and billions of profits, cancer doctors are coming out saying, you're killing people because you're pricing these drugs way too high. Anyhow, back to Henry Wallace. He says, and this is the key to the whole thing, and this is what I would say, Henry Wallace speaking to us from, almost a century ago, 70 years ago, Henry Wallace, Vice President of the United States, speaking to us today about the billionaire class involving themselves in politics, the billionaire business class involving themselves in politics. He said, and I quote, their final objective toward which all their deceit is directed is to capture political power, so that using the power of the state and the power of the marketplace simultaneously, they may keep the common man in eternal subjection. Okay, so that's kind of a starting frame. We have to come up with a better word than fascism. We've had this conversation before. Is it corporatism or what? But to the USA Patriot Act. Step into the Wayback Machine again, only this time instead of going back to 1944, let's just go back to 2001, 2002. After the attacks of 9/11, the Patriot Act was rolled out. Very, very quickly. I mean, this multi-thousand or very large bill, I think it was a couple thousand pages, certainly hundreds of, it was like mostly ready to go. It had been sitting around for years, most of the pieces of it. And it was just unpassable because it was so clearly a violation of the Fourth Amendment of the Constitution that grants us rights of privacy. And arguably a violation of the First Amendment that grants us rights of free speech. And the Senate leader at that time was a guy named Tom Daschle. He was the senator from North Dakota, as I recall. Maybe South Dakota. I mix up my Dakotas. South Dakota. Thank you, Jim. Tom Daschle publicly was saying he was inclined not to even give this thing a vote. The other person that the Patriot Act, in order to pass, had to get through was Pat Leahy, the senior senator from Vermont. He, a former federal prosecutor, was the chairman of the Senate Judiciary Committee. So it had to get out of committee before it could get to the floor, and then to get a vote on the floor, Tom Daschle had to approve it. So the two guys who were standing in the way of the Patriot Act were Tom Daschle and Patrick Leahy. With me so far? And they were relatively public about this. I mean, they weren't saying, no, I'm going to vote against it, but they were clearly not saying I'm going to vote for it. And they were outspoken in their concerns, particularly Leahy. And then, now here's where the Wayback Machine, you may have even forgotten this. Remember the anthrax attacks? 2 members of Congress got anthrax. You know who those 2 members of Congress were? I mean, they didn't contract anthrax, but they're live, weaponized anthrax, only available through the U.S. military, showed up in the offices, in the mail, in the offices of Pat Leahy and Tom Daschle. The only 2 guys. The 2 guys who stood in the way of the Patriot Act got anthrax. Got they were the subjects of the anthrax. They had to move out of their offices. Their offices were quarantined. They had to leave all their papers behind. And then a week or so later was the vote on the Patriot Act. And both of them had said, okay, I give. That was then. Now we're reauthorizing this, right? And back to Henry Wallace. They claimed to be super patriots, but they would destroy every liberty guaranteed by the Constitution. Now that we're reauthorizing this, what was the lead story last night on most of the networks? I didn't watch all the network newses like ABC, CBS, and NBC. Maybe you did. And if you did, give us a call. Let us know. I'd like to hear what kind of coverage you saw over the last 24 hours. But what I saw was, hey, we just discovered that the TSA misses 95% of weapons that people try to smuggle onto airplanes when they test the TSA. Hey, there's been 5 bomb threats against airplanes. Hey, look out, Al-Qaeda wants to come and get you. Well, that was the president saying that. Hey, look out, ISIS. There's speculation. Is ISIS coming through the southern border? What's going on here? I mean, I'm waiting for somebody to get anthrax, God forbid. But apparently they don't need to this time because there's so much money at stake. See, there's 3 pieces to this. And one of them is that this has been privatized. So now you got a billion-dollar industry who is promoting this stuff by lobbying and giving money to members of Congress, number 1. Number 2, you've got a whole media machine that makes more money when people are frightened. And number 1, the nature of bureaucracy, including government bureaucracy, is to grow. Is this a good thing? Are we losing our freedoms?
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
And if so, what do you call it? By the way, Rand Paul is on this. If so, what do you call it if you can't call it fascism because Hitler ruined that word?